Jack Anderson had always tried to stay under the radar at Maple Ridge, a suburban neighborhood known for its pristine lawns and strict HOA rules. He wasn't one to pick fights until the morning he found the bright red violation notice taped to his front door. His heart pounded as he ripped it off, his eyes scanning the bold letters. Immediate fee increase, $600 monthly, vehicle violation. What the hell? Jack muttered, staring at the paper in disbelief. The violation? Having 3 cars in his own driveway? His work truck, essential for his construction business? His wife Emily's SUV, her lifeline for grueling hospital shifts. And the used Honda they had just gifted their son for his 16th birthday. 3 ordinary cars now costing them hundreds more each month. Through the kitchen window, Jack spotted Veronica Blake, the power-hungry HOA president, strutting down the sidewalk with her signature clipboard and tape measure. She stopped in front of his house, phone out, snapping photos like a crime scene investigator. Jack's jaw clenched. This was personal. "She's at it again," Emily called from the living room, her voice tight with frustration. Jack took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But inside, a storm brewed. For years, he'd watched Veronica bully neighbors with absurd fines and rules. But this was the final straw. He didn't know it yet, but that notice on his door had just started a war, one Veronica Blake would deeply regret. Jack Anderson sat at his dining room table, the crumpled HOA violation notice spread out before him like a declaration of war. His coffee had gone cold, untouched, as his mind raced. For years, he had watched Veronica Blake, the self-appointed queen of Maple Ridge, wield her HOA power like a tyrant. Fining neighbors for grass growing an inch too tall, slapping penalties on holiday decorations that lingered a day too long, and now, charging him $600 a month just for parking his own cars in his own driveway. But Veronica had no idea who she was messing with. You see, while she strutted around the neighborhood with her clipboard and ruler, Jack had been quietly playing the long game. For 6 years, he'd been purchasing homes in Maple Ridge, one by one, through different LLCs tied to his real estate investment company, Anderson Holdings. Every time a neighbor sold their home, Jack made sure his company was first in line. It had started as a smart investment strategy, but with Veronica's constant harassment, it had turned into something else, a plan. Now, with the latest property acquisition finalized just last week, Jack owned 72% of the homes in Maple Ridge, and that meant one thing: he controlled the HOA. But Veronica? She didn't have a clue. Jack leaned back in his chair, a slow grin creeping across his face as he pulled out his phone. A fresh text buzzed in from his lawyer. "Closing complete. You now hold majority ownership." "This is it," Jack whispered to himself, feeling the adrenaline kick in. The power was finally his. But the timing had to be perfect. He couldn't just waltz into a meeting and announce his dominance. No, this had to be theatrical, poetic justice. After years of Veronica's bullying, she deserved to be publicly unmasked in front of the very community she had tormented. And fate was on his side. That afternoon, Jack received an email from the HOA board. Emergency meeting scheduled, Thursday, 7 p.m. Topic: new restrictions and increased fines. The subject line alone sent his blood boiling, but inside he smiled. Veronica was planning another ambush, but she didn't know she was walking straight into his trap. Jack pulled out the community map he had been meticulously updating for years. Each home he owned was highlighted in red. The map was a sea of crimson. He chuckled, imagining Veronica's face when she realized how deep his reach went. But here's where I need you, the viewer. What would you do if you were in Jack's shoes? Would you reveal your secret right away and crush Veronica on the spot? Or would you play the long game, let her dig her own grave, and pull the rug out when she least expects it? And don't forget, if you're loving this story, smash that like button and subscribe for part 3, where Jack's master plan unfolds, and Veronica's world starts to crumble in ways she never expected. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Things are about to get real. Thursday night arrived, and the tension in Maple Ridge was palpable. Jack Anderson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, straightening his tie, his reflection calm but his mind racing. This was it. the moment he had been preparing for over 6 years. Tonight, Veronica Blake thought she was going to solidify her stranglehold on the community. Little did she know, she was about to walk right into his perfectly laid trap. Downstairs, Emily sat at the kitchen table, nervously tapping her fingers against her coffee mug. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Jack met her gaze. Jack met her gaze, his eyes steely. "Absolutely. It's time someone put Veronica in her place." He grabbed his leather briefcase, the one holding all the documents, deeds, and evidence that would flip the HOA on its head, and walked out the door, the cool evening air hitting him like a surge of adrenaline. The Maple Ridge Community Center was already buzzing when Jack arrived. Neighbors filled every seat, whispering among themselves, heads turning as he entered. He spotted Veronica Blake at the front of the room, standing proudly behind the podium, her pink clipboard in hand. She wore a smug smile, dressed in her usual pastel power suit, the picture of authority, or at least what she thought authority looked like. Jack took a seat in the back row, his briefcase resting on his lap. He could feel the stares, some sympathetic, others curious. He was, after all, the main target of tonight's emergency meeting. Veronica banged her sparkly pink gavel on the podium. "Let's begin," she chirped, her voice laced with condescension. "We're here tonight to address the growing problem of property violations that threaten the very fabric of our beautiful community." The projector screen behind her lit up with slides, photos of Jack's driveway, zoomed-in images of his 3 parked cars, taken from every imaginable angle. One picture made it look like he had a junkyard on his property, even though it was just his work truck, Emily's SUV, and their son's Honda. "Mr. Anderson's blatant disregard for HOA guidelines is undermining our neighborhood's integrity," Veronica continued, her fake smile glued to her face. "If we let this slide, what's next? Boats on the lawns? RVs on the streets?" A few gasps rippled through the audience. Jack clenched his jaw but stayed silent. Let her dig deeper. "And so," Veronica declared, "I propose a new bylaw limiting households to 2 vehicles, both of which must be stored inside the garage. No exceptions." She lifted a stack of papers. "We'll be voting on it tonight." Murmurs spread through the room. Jack could see the discomfort in some of his neighbors' faces. They weren't all fans of Veronica's iron fist rule, but many were too intimidated to speak up. Veronica locked eyes with Jack, her smirk widening. "Mr. Anderson, care to explain why you think you're above the rules?" Jack stood up slowly, the room falling into a hushed silence. "Actually, Veronica," he said, his voice calm but powerful, "I do have something to say. But maybe I should wait until we're ready to talk about who really owns this neighborhood." The color drained from Veronica's face, but she quickly recovered, waving him off. "This is not the time, Mr. Anderson." Jack opened his briefcase, pulling out a large property map. "I think it's exactly the time." Gasps echoed around the room as Jack unfolded the map, revealing dozens of highlighted homes, properties he now owned. Veronica's eyes widened. For the first time that night, she was truly rattled. And Jack wasn't done yet. The community center fell into an eerie silence as Jack Anderson stood at the front, the massive property map spread across the table. His hands were steady, but inside his heart was pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for. 6 years of meticulous planning coming to a head. The sea of red highlighted homes on the map painted a clear picture. Jack didn't just live in Maple Ridge, he owned it. Veronica Blake, still clutching her pink clipboard, looked like a deer caught in headlights. Her smug smile had vanished, replaced by a thin, strained line. "Well, what is this?" she stammered, though deep down she already knew the answer. Jack raised his voice, addressing the entire room. "This," he said, tapping the map, "is a record of every property I've acquired over the past 6 years. Through Anderson Holdings, I now own 72% of the homes in Maple Ridge." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Neighbors turned to one another, their eyes wide with shock. But that's not legal," Veronica barked, her voice cracking. "You can't just buy up the neighborhood and think you can waltz in here and—" Jack cut her off, calm but firm. "Actually, Veronica, I can. And I did. You see, the HOA bylaws clearly state that any property owner with a majority stake holds voting control. He paused for effect, locking eyes with her. That means I have the final say. The weight of his words hit the room like a tidal wave. Veronica's carefully built empire was crumbling right before her eyes. But Jack wasn't done yet. Let's talk about this so-called emergency meeting, he continued, flipping through a stack of documents from his briefcase. Veronica called this meeting to impose stricter fines and new rules, ones that would hurt families who've lived here for years. But what she didn't expect was for someone to hold her accountable.
He clicked the remote, and the projector behind him lit up. Grainy but clear security footage played across the screen. There was Veronica, creeping around the neighborhood late at night, measuring grass lengths, taking photos of cars, and, shockingly, placing warning notes on properties she didn't like. The crowd gasped. Someone in the back muttered, "She's been spying on us?" "Oh, it gets better," Jack said, hitting play on another clip. This one showed Veronica laughing at a neighborhood barbecue, openly bragging about how she finds certain families just because she doesn't like their vibe. The room erupted. People were furious, years of bottled-up frustration bubbling over. Veronica's face turned bright red. "This is slander," she shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by angry murmurs. Jack raised his hands to calm the room. "I think it's time we held a real vote on whether this community wants someone like Veronica leading the HOA. And hey, if you're loving this showdown, hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, things are only heating up. In the next part, you won't believe what Jack discovers about Veronica's shady dealings that could land her in even deeper trouble. Stay tuned. This war isn't over yet. The tension inside the Maple Ridge Community Center was now so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jack Anderson stood tall at the podium, his heart racing but his expression calm. Around him, his neighbors buzzed with anger and disbelief, still reeling from the footage of Veronica Blake, their iron-fisted HOA president, snooping around at midnight, measuring grass blades and slapping arbitrary fines on whoever she didn't like. But Jack wasn't finished, not even close. He tapped the microphone, silencing the murmurs. "I know many of you are furious, and rightfully so, but I've got something even more disturbing to show you." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick binder, slamming it onto the table. "This," he said, "is a complete financial audit of the HOA's spending over the past 5 years. Veronica's face turned ghostly pale. You can't just—" "Save it," Jack cut her off, flipping the binder open. "Thanks to my lawyer and a few inside sources, we've traced every dime that was supposed to go toward community improvements, like the pool repairs, park maintenance, and streetlights." He clicked the remote, and the projector behind him displayed spreadsheet after spreadsheet of HOA expenses. But the totals didn't add up. Massive chunks of money were marked as miscellaneous, consulting fees, or worse, unaccounted expenses. Then came the smoking gun. Jack zoomed in on one particular line item, $85,000 allocated for community pool renovations, funds that had mysteriously vanished while the pool sat in disrepair for the past 2 summers. "Now, here's where things get interesting," Jack continued. He pulled up another set of documents, bank statements this time. "We found that $85,000 didn't go to the pool contractor. Instead, it was funneled into a personal account, under the name Veronica Blake." The room exploded in outrage. Neighbors were on their feet, shouting and demanding answers. "Is this true?" Mrs. Rodriguez from 2 doors down yelled. "Where's our money, Veronica?" Someone else bellowed. Veronica's hands trembled as she gripped her pink clipboard like a life raft. This is a setup. I never—" But Jack wasn't done. "Oh, and it doesn't stop there," he said, flipping to another page. "We also uncovered payments for landscaping services, $20,000 worth. But guess what? The landscaper was actually her cousin who never did a single day's work." Veronica's facade cracked completely. She tried to grab the papers, but Jack pulled them away. The entire room was in an uproar now. Neighbors who had been silently suffering under Veronica's reign were finally unleashing years of pent-up anger. Jack raised his voice over the chaos. I propose an immediate vote to not only remove Veronica from her position, but to file charges for fraud and embezzlement. The crowd roared in agreement, many shouting, Vote! 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 And hey, if you're as hooked as I am on this wild HOA drama, smash that like button and subscribe, because in the next part, things take an even darker turn when Jack discovers who was secretly helping Veronica all along. You won't believe what happens next. Stay tuned. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with anxious neighbors from Maple Ridge, many still stunned from the revelations about Veronica Blake. Jack Anderson sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, while Veronica sat across the room, flanked by her expensive attorney, trying and failing to maintain her usual composure. Her pristine pastel suit looked less polished under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, and for the first time, her trademark pink clipboard was nowhere in sight. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward, scanning the thick stack of documents Jack's lawyer had submitted. So let me get this straight, the judge began. You're alleging that Mrs. Blake has been embezzling HOA funds, harassing residents, and enforcing arbitrary rules for personal gain? Jack's lawyer stood, confidently clearing his throat. That's correct, Your Honor. We've provided extensive evidence, including financial records, surveillance footage, and testimonies from multiple residents who've been directly affected by her actions. The judge arched an eyebrow and glanced at Veronica. Mrs. Blake, do you have anything to say in your defense? Veronica shot to her feet, her voice quivering but laced with her signature arrogance. This is all a witch hunt. I have dedicated years to making Maple Ridge the beautiful, orderly community it is today. These accusations are baseless. Jack fought to keep his composure, but inside, his blood boiled. He stood up, his voice calm but powerful. Your Honor, with all due respect, we have documented proof that Mrs. Blake funneled over $85,000 meant for community pool renovations into her personal bank account. We also have emails where she openly mocked residents and bragged about manipulating HOA rules to target specific families. The judge's eyes darkened as he flipped through the evidence. That's serious fraud, Mrs. Blake. But Jack wasn't finished. He pulled out one last folder, laying it flat on the table. And it gets worse, he said grimly. We discovered that Mrs. Blake had been using HOA funds to pay off a private investigator, someone who had been following certain residents, taking photos, and collecting personal information, all without consent. The courtroom gasped. Jack's neighbors turned to each other, their faces filled with horror and betrayal. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice thunderous. Enough, Mrs. Blake. You've not only violated the trust of your community, but also broken multiple laws in the process. Veronica's face drained of all color. Her attorney whispered frantically in her ear, but it was clear they had no way out. I'm ordering a full audit of the HOA's finances, the judge continued. And Mrs. Blake, you are hereby removed from your position as HOA president, effective immediately. Furthermore, criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and harassment will be pursued. The room erupted, not with chaos, but with a collective sigh of relief. Years of tyranny were finally over. Jack sat down, exhaling deeply, feeling the weight of the past 6 years lift off his shoulders. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of his neighbors, many of whom he had barely spoken to before this. But now they nodded at him in gratitude and respect. But even as the judge called for a recess, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something darker still lurked beneath the surface. Exposing Veronica had been just the beginning. There were whispers about others involved, people who had helped cover up her crimes, and Jack was ready to dig deeper. The aftermath of Veronica Blake's downfall sent ripples through Maple Ridge. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact on the streets now greeted each other with smiles. Lawns looked less like military zones, holiday decorations went up without fear of citations, and most importantly, the neighborhood began to heal. But Jack Anderson knew the work wasn't over. With Veronica stripped of her title and awaiting criminal charges, Jack took on the role of interim HOA president. not because he wanted power, but because he needed to fix what had been broken. The very next week, Jack called for an emergency community meeting, not in the sterile, suffocating community center, but at the local park under the evening sky. Dozens of residents gathered, many bringing lawn chairs, snacks, and even kids who played freely for the first time without the threat of a violation. Jack stood on a makeshift podium, a simple wooden crate, holding a microphone, but this time there was no air of confrontation, just hope. "Thank you all for coming," Jack began, scanning the crowd. "We've been through a lot, and I know trust isn't something that comes back overnight. But I want us to rebuild Maple Ridge, not just as a neighborhood, but as a community." There was a collective murmur of agreement. Faces that had once been tight with worry now softened. "I propose a complete overhaul of our HOA," Jack continued. "No more secret meetings, no more ridiculous fines for grass height or parking in your own driveway. We're going to make decisions together." The crowd erupted into applause. "From now on," Jack said, "HOA funds will go where they belong, into the community. We'll finally fix the pool, update the playground, and offer assistance to residents who need help maintaining their homes, especially our elderly neighbors." Mrs. Rodriguez, a widow who had been fined countless times under Veronica's rule, wiped tears from her eyes and gave Jack a grateful nod. But Jack wasn't done. "And there's one more thing. We'll be holding new elections for a permanent HOA board, this time with term limits and full transparency." That last part got the loudest cheer. As the meeting ended, something extraordinary happened. Neighbors didn't just pack up and leave, they lingered. Conversation sparked between people who had barely spoken before. Kids played tag around the park, adults shared stories, and the cold, oppressive feeling that had hung over Maple Ridge for years finally evaporated. That night, as Jack walked home with Emily and their son, he looked around at the peaceful, lively streets. Porch lights twinkled, kids rode bikes down the sidewalk, and for the first time in years, Maple Ridge felt like home again. But as they approached their house, Jack noticed something strange, an unmarked envelope sitting on their doorstep. He picked it up, feeling a cold pit form in his stomach. Opening it, he found a single sheet of paper with just 5 words written in bold letters. "This isn't over, Jack Anderson." His heart raced. Veronica was out of the picture, but someone else was still watching. Jack stood on his front porch, the mysterious note still in his trembling hands. The words, "This isn't over, Jack Anderson," echoed in his mind like a warning bell. He scanned the street, eyes darting from car to car, neighbor to neighbor, but everything seemed normal, too normal. Kids played basketball down the block, sprinklers watered perfectly trimmed lawns, and yet a chill crawled up Jack's spine. "Who would send this?" Emily whispered behind him, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Jack muttered, folding the note carefully and slipping it into his pocket. "But I'm going to find out." The next morning, Jack installed new security cameras around the house, covering every angle. But as the days passed, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The community was thriving. Neighbors pitched in to fix the pool. The playground was getting a long overdue facelift, and families were finally enjoying their homes without the oppressive weight of the old HOA. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was still lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't until a week later that the pieces started falling into place. He was reviewing HOA financial documents, digging deeper into Veronica's shady dealings, when he noticed something odd. Several large transactions, labeled as consulting fees, had been routed through a shell company. Tracing the paper trail, Jack discovered the company was owned by none other than Brian Walker, Veronica's right-hand man on the HOA board. Brian had played the part of the silent bystander for years, always staying in the background, never drawing too much attention. But now, it was clear. He wasn't just complicit. He was orchestrating the deeper corruption. That evening, Jack arranged a private meeting with Brian at the Maple Ridge Community Center. Brian arrived, all smiles and handshakes, but Jack could see the tension in his eyes. "So, Jack, what's this about?" Jack didn't waste time. He slid the stack of evidence across the table. "I know about the shell company, Brian, The fake consulting fees. You were in on it from the start. For a moment, Brian's facade held strong, but then his face paled and his hands clenched into fists. You have no idea what you're getting into, he hissed. Try me, Jack shot back, leaning in. Brian exhaled sharply, the cracks in his confidence widening. You think taking down Veronica fixed everything? She was just the puppet. There are people with money, real power, who want control of Maple Ridge. They don't care about HOA rules or community gardens. They want to turn this place into a luxury development, and they'll do whatever it takes. Jack's stomach sank. It wasn't about petty fines or control. It was about tearing down Maple Ridge for profit. And that note on my doorstep? Jack asked coldly. Brian smirked, his mask of calm returning. A friendly warning. Back off, Jack, before you end up regretting this. But Jack's resolve only hardened. You can tell whoever's behind this that I'm not going anywhere. This is my community, and I'm going to protect it, no matter what. As Brian left, Jack sat in the empty community center, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The battle against Veronica had only been the beginning. The real fight was just starting,